23 stabs. It was not an execution, it was a ritual, a bloodbath in the marble heart of Rome. The man who believed himself a god, Gaius Julius Caesar, lay bleeding out at the feet of the statue of his greatest enemy, Pompey the Great. The irony is brutal. The assassins, men who had dined with him the night before, raise their bloody daggers. They do not flee and they shout. They call themselves the Liberators. They believe that on that day, the Ides of March of 44 BC, they had saved the Republic, that they had cut off the head of the serpent of tyranny. In their arrogance, they thought the people of Rome would pour into the streets to cheer them, to thank them for restoring their freedom. But the people did not acclaim them. The silence in the forum was their first death sentence, a heavy, dense silence laden with fear. Not fear of the dead tyrant, but of them, the men who had unleashed chaos. Why did the people they claimed to have saved receive them with terror and not with flowers? Because the average Roman did not live in the villas of senators, he lived in harsh reality. And Caesar, the tyrant, had given them stability, victories, and bread. The Liberators, on the other hand, offered only an abstract idea of freedom and blood. The mastermind behind the plot, Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man consumed by personal resentment. In the face, the symbol, Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's adopted son, the man whose betrayal delivered the mortal wound. It is said that Caesar's last words upon seeing his face were not of anger, but of painful surprise. Et tu, brute. They believed they had won. They marched to the Capitol. They barricaded themselves, expecting the city to recognize them as the new fathers of the fatherland. They underestimated one man, a man who had not drawn a dagger, but whose words would prove sharper than any steel, the consul Mark Antony. And worse still, they underestimated a ghost, a name. Hundreds of kilometers away in Apollonia, an 18-year-old youth, sickly and unknown, receives a letter informing him that his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, has been assassinated. But that is not the news that will change the world. The real bombshell is in the will. Caesar has adopted him as his son and principal heir. That boy, ignored by all, will become the embodiment of vengeance. He did not inherit only Caesar's fortune, he inherited his name. And with that name, a blood oath. His name was Gaius Octavius. His arrival in Rome would mark the beginning of the end for each of the 60 men who plunged their steel into the body of his adoptive father. They did not know it yet, but they had not killed a man. They had unleashed two monsters, civil war and Octavius. The hunt was about to begin, and it would not stop until the last of the Liberators paid his debt in blood. For a moment, it seemed blood would not call for more blood. In a desperate move to avoid civil war, the Senate granted amnesty to the assassins a fragile, tense pardon. Brutus and Cassius descended from the Capitol, believing they had weathered the storm. They even dined with Mark Antony in a truce as false as the smiles on their faces. They controlled the Senate, they had the daggers, they thought they had power. Their mistake was allowing Caesar a state funeral. Brutus spoke first. His speech was a work of stoic logic. Cold, reasoned, philosophical. He appealed to virtue, to duty, to love of the Republic. He explained that he did not kill Caesar out of hatred, but out of love for Rome. It was not that he loved Caesar less, but that he loved Rome more. The confused crowd nodded. They seemed to accept the terrible necessity of the act. The Liberators breathed in relief. But then Mark Antony ascended the rostra. He did not shout, he did not accuse. His voice was a whisper of pain that nevertheless reached every corner of the forum. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, he began. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. He said Brutus was an honorable man, that they all were. He repeated the phrase over and over, honorable men, and with each repetition, the word honorable rotted, turning into poison, into sarcasm sharp as a razor. Then he bent down and lifted the toga covering Caesar's body. The purple cloth, stiff with dried blood, revealed the 23 gashes. Look, here Cassius's dagger entered. See what breach the envious Casca made. And through this one, Beloved Brutus stabbed, turning a political murder into a personal butchery. He made the crowd see not a tyrant, but a betrayed man. And then the coup de grace, he pulled out a papyrus scroll, Caesar's will. The crowd held its breath as Antony read that Caesar bequeathed his private gardens to the people of Rome to be turned into public parks forever. And then the finishing blow, Caesar left to every Roman citizen, to every man in that square, a sum of 75 drachmas. Hell broke loose. Brutus's logical speech vanished before pure emotion. The people's love for their murdered benefactor exploded in an uncontrollable wave of violence. They tore benches and tables from the forum to build an improvised funeral pyre for their hero right there. Then, with torches lit from that sacred fire, the mob turned into a pack of wolves. They no longer sought liberators, they sought assassins. Their first victim was an unfortunate poet named Gaius Helvius Cinna. They mistook him for one of the conspirators, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. His pleas mattered not, nor his cries that he was only a poet. They tore him limb from limb in the middle of the street. It was the first payment of the blood debt. Brutus, Cassius, and the others watched the flames from their homes. They saw the people they claimed to have liberated march toward them with torches and knives. Their republican dream had become a nightmare. They had to flee Rome like thieves in the night. They were no longer senators, they were fugitives. And as they ran for their lives to the east, the real danger, the young Octavius landed in southern Italy. He brought no army, he brought something far more powerful, Caesar's name and a seemingly bottomless checkbook. And he was about to use both to buy the loyalty of Rome's deadliest weapon, his father's legions. While Rome burned and the assassins fled, Octavius played his own game, a chess match on a board of blades. Upon arriving in Rome, he presented himself to Mark Antony. The new master of the city, Antony saw him for what he was, a pale boy, inexperienced, a mere nuisance. He refused to hand over Caesar's fortune, using the money to consolidate his own power. It was a miscalculation that would cost him the world. They underestimated his name. Octavius began signing as Caesar Octavianus, a stroke of genius for the people and the legions. He was Caesar, and when Antony denied him the money, Octavius did the unthinkable. He sold his own properties and those inherited from his family to pay the people the 75 drachmas the will promised. He kept his father's word. Overnight, the boy became the favorite of the plebs and, more importantly, of the veterans of Caesar's legions, battle-hardened men who had adored their general. They saw in that youth the reincarnation of their leader. Octavius did not ask for loyalty. He bought it with money, promises, and above all with the power of an immortal name. He stole Antony's legions right from under his nose. Tension exploded. The two avengers of Caesar declared war on each other. But while they fought in northern Italy, alarming news arrived from the east. Brutus and Cassius were not wasting time. They had plundered the eastern provinces, amassing a gigantic war chest. They had recruited and formed 19 legions, a formidable army, funded by extortion and ready to march on Italy. Antony and Octavius realized a terrifying truth. They hated Caesar's assassins more than they hated each other. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Antony, Octavius, and a third man, Lepidus, Caesar's general. There, amid mud and fog, these three men formed the second triumvirate. It was not an alliance, it was a pact of predators. They divided the world like spoils. And then, to fund their war and eliminate enemies at home, they unleashed terror. The proscriptions were not a mere list of enemies, they were a public death sentence. Hundreds of senators and thousands of the wealthy class were declared enemies of the state. Their names, written on plaster tablets, were nailed in the forum. Anyone could kill them. It was not only permitted, there was a reward. The killer received a share of the dead man's property. The rest went to the triumvirate. Rome sank into bloody paranoia. Slaves murdered their masters to gain freedom. Sons betrayed fathers for inheritance. No one was safe. And on that list, Antony demanded one name above all: Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator. Cicero was not one of the assassins, but his speeches against Antony had doomed him. Octavius, who owed Cicero his political rise, Agreed, Antony. He sacrificed him without blinking. Antony's hitmen caught him near his villa. Cicero ordered his servants not to resist and offered his neck. They cut off his head and hands, the very hands that had written the speeches that so offended Antony. They carried them to Rome and, in an act of supreme barbarity, nailed them to the rostra, the platform from which Cicero had spoken so many times. The vengeance was total, with Rome purged and their coffers filled with the blood of enemies. The triumvirate turned their gaze east. The purge was over. Now the war began. Brutus and Cassius were not hiding. They had gathered in Greece with their 19 legions. The final confrontation that would decide the fate of the Republic was inevitable. The end of the Roman world gathered on a plain in Greece called Philippi. It was not one army against another. It was one era against the next. On one side, Octavius and Antony, with Caesar's name as banner and vengeance as fuel. On the other, Brutus and Cassius, with the dying idea of the Republic and the memory of a bloody dagger. More than 200,000 men, the greatest concentration of Roman military power history had ever seen, were about to annihilate each other. The Liberators' plan was clever, dictated by Cassius's cold logic, an experienced general. Their army was better supplied and controlled the sea. Their strategy? Wait. Avoid pitched battle. Let hunger and disease wear down the triumvir's legions. But Brutus was no strategist. He was a philosopher playing general. He was tormented. It was said that in his camp the omens were terrible. 2 eagles that followed his legions were replaced by crows and vultures the day they reached Philippi. And legend says that nights before the battle, a ghostly and terrible apparition appeared in his tent. "Who are you?" Brutus asked. The shadow replied, "I am your evil spirit, Brutus. We shall meet at Philippi." It was Caesar's ghost, or the ghost of his own guilt. Pressed by impatient officers and haunted by demons, Brutus imposed his will. They would force the battle. Cassius, against his better judgment, yielded. The first battle of Philippi was a chaos of blood and dust. On the right flank, Brutus's legions, with unstoppable fury, overran Octavius's, broke their lines, massacred his men, and plundered his camp. Octavius, ill, barely escaped with his life. From his perspective, it was a crushing victory. The Republic seemed reborn in one glorious assault. But at the same time on the other flank, the story was radically opposite. Mark Antony's veteran troops, more disciplined, shattered Cassius's legions. Antony's attack was brutal, relentless. Cassius's camp was taken, his men massacred or put to flight, 2 simultaneous battles with opposite outcomes amid the fog of war. Cassius had withdrawn to a hill to observe the battlefield. He saw in the distance that Brutus's camp had been taken, but he could not know it was Brutus's own men celebrating and looting. Then he saw a cavalry detachment galloping toward him. They were Brutus's men coming to announce victory, but in the dust and distance, Cassius thought it was enemy cavalry. He believed Brutus had been defeated. He believed all was lost. The fog of war and a cloud of dust doomed the man who had started it all. "Take this," he said to his freedman, handing him a dagger. "Free me from life." Pindarus obeyed. Cassius covered his face with his cloak and received the blow. He died at the hand of his own slave, using, according to legend, the same dagger with which he had stabbed Julius Caesar in the Senate. The final irony for a practical man, defeated not by the enemy, but by a tragic illusion. Shortly after, Brutus's messengers reached the hill shouting news of victory. They found only their commander's corpse. When Brutus arrived and saw the body of his friend and brother-in-law, his spirit broke. He called him through tears the last of the Romans, Cassius. The brain of the conspiracy was dead, but Brutus, the soul of the movement, still lived. He commanded an army that was still formidable. For 3 weeks, the 2 sides watched each other, tension growing with each dawn. Brutus knew time was against him. His men were demoralized. Victory had turned to ashes in his mouth. Pressed by his own troops and tormented by Caesar's ghost, he made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered a second and final attack. 3 weeks, 21 dawns in which the remnants of the Republic's greatest army and the embodiment of Caesar's vengeance watched each other across a valley soaked in blood. In Brutus's camp, morale had collapsed. The ghost of Cassius and his useless death weighed on everyone. His legionaries, many of them mercenaries, began to desert. His officers pressed him, demanding one last battle before the entire army dissolved. Brutus, the philosopher, the idealist, no longer had control. He was trapped by the current of events he himself had unleashed. The Second Battle of Philippi had none of the chaotic uncertainty of the first. It was a massacre. Brutus's legions charged with desperation, not conviction. They faced the veteran troops of Antony and Octavius' hardened men, better commanded, fighting for victory, not to avoid defeat. The Republican lines bent, then broke. The retreat became an uncontrolled flight. The dream of the Republic did not die with a defiant shout, but with the sound of thousands of men running to save their lives. Brutus managed to escape the battlefield with a handful of his most loyal officers. They hid in the nearby hills, listening to their enemies' victory cries and the sound of Antony's cavalry sweeping the area, searching for him. The man who had ruled Rome for a moment was now a cornered fugitive in the darkness of a Greek forest. There, in the cold night, Brutus knew it was all over. He looked at his friends and spoke the words that revealed the fracture of his soul. He lamented that the virtue for which he had sacrificed everything might be nothing more than an empty word, and that he had been a slave to fortune. The idealist crashed against the wall of reality. He had killed his friend and mentor for an idea, and that idea had just died before his eyes. He would not allow himself to be captured. The humiliation of being dragged through Rome's streets in Octavius's triumphal parade was a fate worse than death. He asked one of his officers, Clitus, to kill him. Clitus refused, weeping. He asked another, Dardanius, who also refused. Finally, he approached his friend Strato. He asked him to hold his sword with the point toward him. Strato, with tears in his eyes, obeyed. Brutus used his last strength to run onto the blade. He died instantly. The soul of the conspiracy was extinguished. Shortly after, Antony's men found his body. Mark Antony, in an act of unexpected nobility, removed his costly purple general's cloak and covered his enemy's corpse. Later, he would say that Brutus was the noblest of all Romans, the only conspirator who acted from an ideal, not envy. Octavius shared no such respect. When they brought him the news, his reaction was icy. He ordered Brutus's head cut off and sent to Rome to be thrown at the feet of Julius Caesar's statue. Octavius's vengeance knew no nobility, only total annihilation. The contrast between the two victors at that moment sowed the seeds of the war to come between them. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the heads of the conspiracy had been cut off. To the world, somehow, the civil war was over. But Octavius did not think so. For him, vengeance was not complete, not until every one of the 60 men who wielded a dagger that day was dead. The Great War was over. Now began the silent hunt, a purge that would spread to every corner of the Mediterranean. For the remaining assassins, hell was just beginning. After the Battle of Philippi, Roman world power lay in the hands of 3 men, and one of them, Octavius, had an obsession. The list of the 60 men who had taken part in his father's murder. Brutus and Cassius were only the first 2 major names crossed off. Dozens remained. And now the triumvirs had armies, fleets, spies, and an almost unlimited treasury to find them. There was no corner of the Mediterranean where they could hide. The amnesty had been a farce. Proscription was now law. Gaius Trebonius, the man who astutely kept Mark Antony out of the Senate while the others stabbed Caesar, thought himself safe as governor of Asia, but a general loyal to Antony captured him, tortured him for days seeking information, then beheaded him. His head was used as a ball by soldiers in the streets of Smyrna. He was one of the first to die, a brutal warning of the mercy they could expect. Decimus Junius Brutus, Albinus not to be confused with the Marcus Brutus, was one of Caesar's closest friends, one of his brightest generals. Caesar had named him in his will as second-choice heir if Octavius refused. It was he who, on the morning of the Ides, convinced a hesitant Caesar to go to the Senate in intimate and devastating betrayal. After Philippi, His legions in Gaul abandoned him. Suddenly, the powerful general was a lone man. He tried to cross the Alps disguised as a Gallic chieftain. He sought refuge with a local chief he had once called friend. But loyalty has a price, and Decimus Brutus's head was worth a fortune. The Gallic chief did not hesitate. He murdered him in his own house and sent the head as a gift to Mark Antony. The friend who convinced Caesar to walk to his death was betrayed by a friend for the promise of gold. One by one they fell. Lucius Cassius, brother of the chief conspirator, was killed by Octavius's order after the battle. Publius Servilius Casca, the first man to plunge his dagger into Caesar, fled Philippi like a ghost. Legend says he wandered the world, tormented by guilt, until he took his own life in an unknown place, or perhaps the sea claimed him in a storm. His death is a mystery. His body was never found. As if the earth itself refused him burial, the hunt lasted more than a decade. It proved Octavius's implacable memory. The last of the major assassins to die was Cassius Parmensis, a poet and writer who had put his pen at the service of the Republic. After Philippi, his life was an odyssey of flight. He joined the pirate Sextus Pompey in Sicily. When Pompey was defeated, he committed the most ironic act of all. He joined Mark Antony, Caesar's assassin, and Caesar's avenger united against Caesar's son. But he chose the losing side one last time. After Antony's final defeat at the Battle of Actium, more than 14 years after the assassination, Octavius's men finally found him in Athens. He was dragged away and executed without ceremony. With his death, Octavius's list was finally almost complete. One by one they fell in battles, in dark alleys, by their own hand, or by a traitor's. None of Caesar's assassins died of old age. Most died violently, many with the same daggers they had used on the Ides of March, fulfilling a kind of poetic and terrible justice. But while vengeance was consummated, something else was happening. With every Republican senator who died, with every opponent silenced, the power of one man grew until it became absolute. The assassins had stabbed Caesar to kill the idea of a king. In the void they left, they had cultivated the birth of something far more powerful and lasting, an emperor. The final irony of their sacrifice had not yet been revealed in all its magnitude. When the last assassin was hunted down and executed, a strange silence fell over the Roman world. For the first time in nearly 20 years, there was no active civil war. The purge was over, but the peace Octavius brought was the peace of a cemetery. An entire generation of the Roman aristocracy, the men who had led the Senate and commanded legions for centuries, was dead, murdered in the proscriptions, fallen at Philippi, or purged in later wars. The triumvirs pact, forged in the blood of their enemies, could not last. With the world at their feet, the last two predators, Mark Antony and Octavius, turned on each other. It was a propaganda war before it became a war of swords. Octavius, from Rome, painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman general enslaved by a foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome from Egypt. Antony, from Alexandria, saw Octavius as a tyrannical usurper, a greedy boy clinging to power. The final clash came at sea in the Battle of Actium. It was the dying republic's last convulsion. Octavius's victory was total. Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, cornered with no escape, they took their own lives. The general fell on his sword. The queen, according to legend, let an asp bite her. With their deaths, the last challenge to Octavius's power vanished. Now he was alone, completely alone at the top. His father's assassins dead. The old Senate guard dead. His rivals Lepidus exiled and Antony dead. He had avenged Caesar in a way even Julius Caesar himself could not have imagined. He held absolute and unquestioned power over an empire stretching from Spain to Syria. And here the final, most crushing irony of history is revealed. The Liberators had stabbed Caesar because they feared he would crown himself king. They feared one man would destroy 500 years of Republican tradition. Their act, designed to save the Republic, became the catalyst that destroyed it completely. The wars they unleashed annihilated the political class that sustained it, leaving a power vacuum only one man could fill. Octavius had learned his father's lesson. He did not declare himself dictator for life. He used no crown. He was far cleverer. In the year 27 BC, he entered the Senate and, in a stroke of political genius, resigned all his extraordinary powers and declared the Republic restored. It was a brilliant farce. He kept the appearances of the Republic, the consuls, senators, assemblies, but gradually and legally concentrated all real power in himself. Control of the army, finances, the richest provinces, the Senate, grateful for the peace, granted him a new name, Augustus the Venerable. He became Rome's first emperor. He ruled with power more absolute than Caesar ever dreamed, and did so for more than 40 years. He died of old age in his bed, deified as it were. Brutus, Cassius, and the others had killed a man to stop a king. The result of their sacrifice was not freedom, but the creation of an emperor and the birth of the Roman Empire. In the end, they did not save the Republic. They only ensured that everyone who believed in it died, clearing the way for the new order. Their struggle for freedom became the stepping stone on which Augustus built his throne. The 23 stabs on the Senate floor did not prevent tyranny. They merely chose the tyrant.